A couple of weeks ago, I put out a video titled The Occult Secrets in Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erd Tree. The central thesis of that video was that the Abyssal Serpent, aka the base serpent residing in Messmer's Eye, had the same form and function as a god from alchemical mythology, one known as Mercurius. Though reception to this theory was positive enough to be cited by the almighty Elden Ring lore theorist, Smotown, in his newest video, I nonetheless felt a lacking, because I wasn't able to expand upon my thesis as much as I wanted to. But I have meditated on the theory for the past 2 weeks, and the more I think about it, the more it seems to explain a variety of lingering mysteries that the Elden Ring fandom hasn't found answers for yet. Specifically, it might help explain various elements of the Eternal Cities, like how the Silver Tears were made, and why they can turn into a variety of different things. It might explain what these ghostly figures are coming out of the architecture, and why bodies seemed to be used in the construction of Anir Alim and the Divine Gate. It also might explain some of the prehistory of Mount Gelmir and the ancient serpent god. And more importantly, what the hell this snakeskin is doing here. Before I get into all of that, I will kindly ask that you consider giving this video a like if you end up liking it. That helps me out a lot. And if you want to see more content like this, maybe consider subscribing. So to set things up, let's quickly recap my theory regarding the Abyssal Serpent from the previous video. I linked it to the alchemical god Mercurius because their form and function were virtually the same. Mercurius was the chthonic spirit that dwelled within the abyssal void of space, the first matter, or what the alchemists would call the prima materia, the blackness from which the universe emerged and which holds everything together. The void was one form of Mercurius, but another form was a serpent. Sometimes it was a single serpent, but more often it was a two-headed serpent in the form of the caduceus. The caduceus is, of course, a reference to the Roman god Mercury who carried a caduceus staff. Now, Mercurius's function in the alchemical process was to unite opposite elements into a holy conjunction. The primary example I cited in the last video was the union of the Red King and the White Queen into the Rebus, aka the Divine Hermaphrodite. We can see this most famously illustrated in Sir George Ripley's scroll, where the Red King and White Queen are united by the spirit of Mercurius, in the form of the caduceus. This illustration of the union of opposites, of male and female into the hermaphroditic rebus, was an attempt by the alchemists to personify, to symbolize, their ultimate goal, which of course was the Philosopher's Stone. They are both the same thing and represent a paradox, which the alchemists, amongst many other world religions, took as a sign of ultimate divinity. In respect to Elden Ring, we see this union of male and female into a single divine being with the Red King, Radagon, and the White Queen, Marika. Beyond this example, there are many other references to red and white throughout Elden Ring and many of From Software's other games. I will conclude with the most pertinent example. Messmer's snakes are red and white, which represent the dual-natured Mercurius, the abyssal serpent that resides within him. To quote the 16th century Belgian alchemist Gerard Dorn, "Our Mercurius, in his regeneration, has obtained the power of above and below, wherefore he is to be likened to their marriage, as is evident from the white and red that are conjoined in him." Finally, when the base serpent emerges from within and completes its attack, it dissolves into a black void, the other form of Mercurius. With all of that re-established, we can turn to the other evidence that not only supports the notion that the Abyssal Serpent is Elden Ring's version of Mercurius, but explains those other lingering mysteries. One thing that I briefly mentioned but didn't elaborate on in my last video was that Mercurius is actually made out of a chemical compound, Quicksilver, which was the alchemist's preferred term for mercury. Just like the void, Quicksilver binds and penetrates every aspect of reality. In other words, just like the base serpent sits at the base of every aspect of reality, so too does Quicksilver, for they are one and the same. Quote, "The liquid metal, argentum vivum, living silver, Quicksilver, was the wonderful substance that perfectly expressed the nature of the furbisher, that which glistens and animates within." When the alchemist speaks of Mercurius, on the face of it he means Quicksilver, but inwardly he means the world-creating spirit concealed or imprisoned in matter, that matter being both void and the universe that the void produces. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you have put the pieces together already. I believe that we see this animated, spirit-filled Quicksilver in Elden Ring in the form of the Silver Tears. Not only do they look like Quicksilver, their function is the same as Mercurius. They are both capable of an infinite multitude of transformations. Quote, "In the overwhelming majority of cases, alchemy identifies its transforming substance with the argentum vivum or Mercurius. Chemically, this term denotes Quicksilver. Just as Mercurius's spirit sits at the base of every aspect of reality, so too do the Silver Tears, as evidenced by their mutual ability to transform into a variety of shapes and sizes, including humanoids, weapons, and the Silver Spheres. It also appears to be the case that Quicksilver can transform pre-existing entities and objects into others. The primary piece of evidence for this is the Larval Tears, which also appear to be made out of Quicksilver. The majority of the enemies that drop them in the base game are enemies that transform into different creatures. In the Altus Plateau, if you attack this cowering noble, he will transform into a lion guardian, who drops a larval tear upon defeat. The same is true for this noble in Caelid, who transforms into a troll, this noble in Limgrave, who transforms into a lesser rune bear, and many others, including the Mimic Tier boss, and Bach, who can transform from a demi-human to a human if you give him a larval tear. And speaking of the Eternal Cities, if we accept the notion that Quicksilver can be manipulated to transform into animate and inanimate objects, this would go for architecture as well. But before I address that, I will set things up by stepping back and addressing a different question. Where did the Silver Tears and the Larval Tears come from? I believe the answer to this lies with information we learned from the DLC. As we now know, there was a time when the Omen would take members of Queen Marika's species, the Numen, aka the Shamans, and merge their flesh in jars. This is because the flesh of the Numen/Shamans had the unique ability to blend together. The Omen hoped that by doing this, they might eventually birth saints. It seems to me that the denizens of the Eternal Cities were engaged in a very similar process. The Nox, who appear to be descendants of the Numen, were attempting to birth a Lord of Night so they might overthrow the current power structure in the lands between. In a desperate attempt to do so, they merged the flesh of their fellow Nox/Numen to produce the Larval Tears, which they would then try to foster into their lord. The majority of the Larval Tears that failed to do so would become the Silver Tears. Now, my evidence for this was something I briefly mentioned in the last video. When the Red King and White Queen unite into the Rebis, the personification of the Philosopher's Stone, the product of that union would be the Elixir of Eternal Life, often referred to by the alchemists as the Aqua Permanens. This elixir was the spirit of Mercurius in its most perfect form. This is why, when that spirit is ingested, it grants eternal life. Just as the spirit of Mercurius in the form of the Void birthed all of life, that spirit, in its distilled, perfected form, the Aqua Permanens, will grant everlasting life when ingested. Quote, "Therefore, in alchemy, Mercurius is sometimes a spirit and sometimes a water, the so-called Aqua Permanens, which is none other than Argentum Vivum, and Argentum Vivum is Latin for Quicksilver." So by uniting male and female energies, the divine hermaphrodite, aka the Philosopher's Stone, would produce the divine substance, the transformative chemical agent Quicksilver, that would then be used to create not just their lord, but like I said before, other living beings, weapons, and even architecture. And this is why I believe that not only the buildings in the Eternal Cities have multiple spirits emerging out of them, but also why the same was done for Anir Alim and the Divine Gate. It was done to generate Quicksilver, which would then be molded for divine purposes. For the Nox, it was to build a city and create a Lord of Night. For Mikola, it was to create Anir Alim and to make himself a lord. And just a couple more pieces of evidence on this note that I wasn't able to fit into the flow of the video up until this point. Note this attack that the Jar Innards does. One might argue that after merging male and female bodies, the spirit of Mercurius in the form of the Serpent is trying to emerge. Maybe this is something that the residents of Bonny Village were trying to do. Instead of producing Mercurius as Quicksilver, they were producing Mercurius as a snake. But I will get to more of that in a moment. Also, note the description for the larval tears. It is described as neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between. This reflects Mercurius's function and dual nature. And that's just one of many dual natures that Mercurius represents. Metallic yet liquid, poisonous yet capable of healing, male and female, red and white. Finally, I want to add one more piece of evidence in favor of my Abyssal Serpent equals Mercurius theory. As I said before, one of the most prominent symbols of Mercurius is the caduceus. It is a symbol some of you Dark Souls fans will recognize from the shields in those games. It would be apt to say that the primordial, or some might say base serpents, Frampt and Koth from the first Dark Souls game, represent the caduceus and the dual-natured spirit of Mercurius, residing within the abyssal void. But as far as I think most people know, there is no reference to the caduceus symbol in Elden Ring. Sure, there's the symbol on the depraved perfumer's chest, but that symbol looks fractured and doesn't have two heads. The only other possible reference is the variety of spiral symbols throughout the game, but that does not necessarily suggest something to do with Mercurius. Although I do have more thoughts on that, which I will save for another video. Putting all of this aside though, what if I told you that there was one reference to the caduceus symbol in Elden Ring? Well, there is, and it's behind the throne in Mount Gelmir. It's hard to see because the big chair covers it up, but this concept art makes it much clearer. This suggests to me that maybe the ancient immortal serpent god that was worshipped on Mount Gelmir might have been Mercurius, or whatever his outer god equivalent is. Now, of course, I will fully admit that this notion raises a bunch of other questions. If the ancient god was Mercurius, does that mean that the god-devouring serpent is Mercurius? If so, that would make sense, given the snake's ability to merge with human flesh, as Mercurius also does. But if the god-devouring serpent is Mercurius, why does it only have one head, and why isn't it residing in the abyss? I have some thoughts, but before I quickly detail them, I will be upfront and say that this is just speculation that could easily be wrong, so bear with me. Maybe, just as every lord needs a consort in Elden Ring, devotees of this ancient serpent god tried to produce a consort. Maybe this was Eiglay, whose body we see resting in the Temple of Eiglay in Mount Gelmir. Maybe this is why we see snakeskin that looks very much like Eiglay's in Bonny Village, because the denizens there were trying to use the jar experiments to produce a consort. When the lord and consort are united, they would form the literal and or figurative caduceus. Another possibility that I consider more likely is that the god-devouring serpent is just the light half of the two-headed Mercurius, while the serpent residing in the abyss is the dark half, hence why Mesmer describes it as the abyssal serpent shorn of light. Once the Erd Tree had its shadow split off from it, Maybe Merica or someone else committed a similar act against the ancient Serpent / Mercurius, with one half being Eiglay and the other half residing in the Abyss. Or maybe there's absolutely no meaning to the symbol at all. That's always a possibility. Anyway, even if my theories are wrong, and they easily could be, I don't think most of the stuff I said is unreasonable. I do want to hear what you guys think though on any or all the things I talked about. I especially want to hear people's theories on that bloody snakeskin in Bonny Village. That one has obviously been driving everybody nuts, including myself. Remember to give this video a like if you liked it, that helps me out a ton. Finally, if you like this type of in-depth gaming analysis and want to help ensure its continuation, please consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my YouTube members section. I will leave links to both in the description box below. Thanks guys, and until next time, I want to remind you as always and as per usual, stay yellow.